The story of collapse rarely begins with chaos. It usually begins with confidence, with experts assuring stability, with institutions claiming control, and with societies believing that the system guiding them is permanent and inevitable. This documentary is not about a sudden disaster. It is about a slow erosion, a gradual draining of meaning, security, and dignity from two regions that once claimed to represent the peak of human progress, Europe and the United States, civilizations that were not defeated by foreign armies or natural cataclysms, but weakened from within by an interest-based global financial system that quietly transformed money from a servant of society into its unquestioned master. After the devastation of the Second World War, Europe stood shattered physically, but alive with hope, while America emerged as the dominant economic power, untouched at home and confident in its vision for the future. Reconstruction was framed as generosity, cooperation, and modernization, yet embedded within that recovery was a structural decision that would define the next century. Rebuilding would be financed not through shared sacrifice, but through debt. Loans would replace solidarity, interest would replace trust, and money itself would be separated from real human value. The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories, ports, and highways, but it also rewired European economies to depend on borrowing, locking national survival to repayment schedules and financial markets rather than productive capacity and social cohesion. Governments learned to govern not by asking what their people needed, but by calculating what creditors expected. Across the Atlantic, the United States underwent an equally profound transformation, abandoning the gold standard and embracing fiat money, a system where currency could be created without direct connection to tangible goods or labor, allowing money to emerge primarily as debt. Every new dollar entered the world already incomplete, already demanding more value than it represented, because interest ensured that repayment would always exceed the original amount created. This single design choice altered the logic of civilization itself. Growth was no longer a goal, it became a necessity. Economies had to expand continuously just to avoid collapse, and when expansion slowed, crisis followed. Under this system, banks discovered unprecedented power. They could lend money they did not possess, charge interest on it, bundle the resulting debt into financial products, sell those products globally, insure them against failure, speculate on their collapse, and still be rescued by governments when the system inevitably imploded. Profit was privatized, risk was socialized, and accountability dissolved into abstraction. Finance detached from the real economy, no longer serving production, innovation, or human need, but feeding on itself through speculation, leverage, and complexity. Europe's social model, once celebrated for balancing markets with human welfare, began to fracture under the weight of compounding debt. Nations that had built healthcare systems, public education, and social safety nets found themselves trapped in a contradiction. They possessed the resources, labor, and knowledge to care for their populations, yet were told they could not afford to do so because interest payments consumed national budgets. Greece became the most visible symbol of this transformation, but it was not alone. Italy, Spain, Portugal, and others followed the same path. Austerity was imposed as moral necessity. Suffering was reframed as responsibility. Pensions were cut, hospitals closed, youth unemployment soared, and an entire generation learned that education no longer guaranteed opportunity, only competition for fewer positions in a shrinking real economy. Democratic choice weakened as elected governments were overridden by unelected technocrats whose primary loyalty was not to citizens but to financial institutions. Policy became accounting, leadership became compliance, and the European Union itself, once imagined as a project of unity and peace, increasingly functioned as a mechanism to enforce fiscal discipline over social stability. Meanwhile, the United States projected confidence, innovation, and cultural dominance, yet beneath the surface, the same financial logic hollowed out its foundations. Wages stagnated even as productivity increased. The promise that each generation would live better than the last quietly disappeared. Families maintained living standards not through income, but through borrowing. Credit cards replaced savings, mortgages replaced security, student loans replaced opportunity. Education, once a ladder to mobility, became a lifelong financial burden, binding young people to decades of repayment before their careers even began. Healthcare followed the same trajectory. Illness transformed into a revenue model. Treatment became secondary to billing, and medical bankruptcy became a uniquely American phenomenon among developed nations. Millions worked full-time yet remained poor, not due to laziness or incompetence, but because interest systematically extracted value from wages before it could accumulate. The middle class, once the stabilizing force of American democracy, slowly eroded, squeezed between rising living costs and stagnant pay, watching asset prices inflate beyond reach, while real labor lost dignity and bargaining power. Homes ceased to be places of belonging and became speculative assets. Cities transformed into investment vehicles rather than communities. Entire neighborhoods were priced out of existence, replaced by short-term rentals and luxury developments serving global capital rather than local life. Each financial crisis followed a familiar pattern: deregulation in the name of efficiency, risk-taking in pursuit of higher returns, collapse blamed on individual irresponsibility, and rescue justified to preserve stability. From the savings and loan crisis to the dot-com bubble to the global financial collapse of 2008, trillions of dollars were created almost overnight to stabilize banks deemed too big to fail, while ordinary citizens were told there was no money for schools, infrastructure, or social renewal. Trust in institutions eroded steadily, not because people lacked intelligence, but because lived experience contradicted official narratives. People sensed that the system rewarded speculation over contribution, manipulation over labor, and proximity to capital over creativity or service. Anger searched for targets: immigrants, cultural change, political opponents, neighbors, while the true architecture of extraction remained largely invisible. Interest ensured that wealth flowed upward regardless of effort, converting time itself into collateral. Years of human life were transformed into repayment schedules, and existence became a monthly calculation. Creativity suffocated under bills, families delayed children, societies postponed futures, and mental health crises rose alongside credit limits. Loneliness expanded beside luxury towers. Anxiety became a defining condition of modern life. The system did not fail because it malfunctioned. It failed because it functioned precisely as designed, concentrating wealth, externalizing risk, and turning nations into debt management entities rather than communities of shared purpose. Europe aged under obligation, its youth disillusioned and its future deferred. America fractured into extremes of wealth and despair, its social fabric strained by polarization, mistrust, and chronic insecurity. Beneath all of this lay a simple, devastating truth that history has repeatedly revealed. No civilization has survived indefinitely under a system where money is created primarily as debt and multiplied through interest faster than real value can be produced. Ancient empires debased their currencies, medieval kingdoms borrowed beyond repayment, and modern states now repeat the same pattern under more sophisticated language and technology. The greatest damage inflicted by the interest-based global financial system is not purely economic, but psychological and cultural. People learn to measure their worth through credit scores, to define success by consumption rather than contribution, to limit dreams by affordability rather than imagination. Courage fades when failure means permanent indebtedness. Risk becomes impossible when survival is already leveraged, and societies lose the capacity to envision alternatives because deviation from the system threatens immediate punishment through markets, ratings, and capital flight. Yet history also teaches that systems presented as eternal are always temporary. Money was not always created as debt, economies were not always designed to reward leverage over labor, and communities once organized production around human need rather than abstract growth metrics. The question facing Europe and the United States is not whether decline is occurring, but whether recognition will arrive before collapse becomes irreversible. Because this is not merely a story about finance, it is a warning about civilization itself, about what happens when numbers outrank people, when